Thank you, everybody, for coming here and sharing your experiences. And hopefully what you've gathered from this part so far, or from the beginning or the introduction, is that we need to think outside of our realms. We need to think more broadly about this work that we do. I can tell you that I spent a lot of years in graduate school and messing with technology, et cetera, but the best education I had was the first day that I talked with the subject. You know, I went in to build an anthropomorphic hand, to make it cool, to put really awesome tech in it. But there isn't one of our subjects yet that the first thing they said is, I want an awesome tech hand. Everyone has said, like Brandon has, he's like, I want to hold my wife's hand. And it's not until I have that dialogue that I recognize that my preconceived notions are the problem, or a problem, for sure. And this dialogues we've had, for example, of what it's like to be a subject or not be a subject, and the perspectives of that are very different for different backgrounds. And so I think that when we think broadly about what neurotransmitter is working in the nervous system, or what brain I'm poking, or what trial I'm working on, or what technology I'm building, it's really easy to forget in that day in the lab when you're trying to write the paper and to graduate, or trying to get the next grant done, or whatever it is. It's really easy to forget why we do these things. And ultimately the bigger challenges by which we go at them. And I think that our problem has been that society, or our sciences, have divided this idea of culture and human away from the high-end society or science, where it's like everything is sterile and built separate from that. There's no better place to see that when it comes to, except when you come to the human trials, the clinical trials, but they have to extend all the way back. And so what I'd like to open up this idea and basically to the questions, and hopefully have the floor to discuss, is think about how this might, what are the social issues that have come to your mind through this conversation that you might face, or what is it that you might want to think about that maybe we should be thinking more in terms of pushing our agencies, our funding, and our own practices to develop. Because at the end of the day, if we spend billions of dollars on neural technology and neural things, and we can't have a certain segment of our society that will partake in it because we didn't do that, we just played, I think we've all failed in many different ways. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the roundtable part of the discussion. Hopefully some of you will have some questions, and actually they don't have to be just questions. I'm hoping you can throw out there the statements that make us talk, right? Or make each of it, and I mean the whole room talk, right? Throw out the yeah, but type of conversation, because that's usually where the fun stuff comes from. So I'm going to open for the floor for any questions.
Hi, thank you. Oh, is it on? Can you hear me?
Sounds like it.
Okay, great. My name is Sarah Fontaine, and I support the Spinal Cord Injury Research Program. So I'm very heavily invested in what's happening here. And so something that we've struggled with as a program, just sort of considering assisted device technology and our funding of it, is I always have a niggle in my mind that if we find something which is incredibly useful and really improves the quality of life for the participant and for the subject, and they have to give it back at the end of the trial and not be able to use it on a daily basis. So I just kind of wanted to get your perspectives on, during development, what can we do if we give something amazing to somebody that makes such a difference, if we have to take it back?
Good question. I mean, I think that's, I'm going to turn it over to the panel because I think a better answer than I do for these things, but I think that's fundamentally something we often wrestle with when we're talking long-term chronic implant devices and short-term funding and how we go from there. So, you know, Brandon potentially has maybe some thoughts about that. You've had the experience. I think it's on always.
I've given that some thought. I'll admit in the beginning I did. I wasn't sure, again, if it was going to work to start with. But now that I've used the system, I've given it some thought. You know, what if there's one day I can't go to Cleveland and get to feel my fingers? It'd be tough. But at the same time, if through what the study has taught everybody, if one part of that technology makes one person's life better other than mine, then it's, to me, that's a gain. But again, I'm going to continue to push to make sure that everybody that this technology can help it's afforded to them.
I'll just add that, you know, if you're an academic and you claim that you're doing translational research, that the work that you're doing is has an end user in mind, and you're not working with a company, or you haven't identified a transition partner, the person that's going to take over the work when you publish your papers, then I think you're falling a little bit short of your objective. So,
So I'll add on to that, and if anybody wants to jump in on the table too, but I think therein lies actually, when you think about our field and what we're doing, one of the fundamental challenges, though I appreciate the push that Doug makes. I think we also have the issue of who's going to pick it up, right? It's easy to say we should have a company engaged. It's hard to get that company engaged. More and more they want to push us over the goal line before they even take it on, right? They want the risk to be handled by the academic side. And a lot of times that balance of when it takes, and particularly something like what Brandon has, right? I mean, I think he conveys very well what the impact in his life is, but the insurance company doesn't care. I mean, I say that coldly. Maybe somebody's in the audience to push on that, and from the insurance company. They care about health and quality of life and dollars, but what I've been repeatedly told is, quality of life isn't going to change the bottom line. They're not going to say fund it because Brandon can hold his wife's hand. That's not a cost leader. So it becomes, actually, is that ethical, not ethical? I think these are where it becomes a really interesting question of what are the economics of the situation? What are the ethical situation of the economics? And I think the other question too that you raise is, and I think somebody else on this panel said it earlier, if you take that device away, you're injuring them again. So I hadn't really put it that, I mean, I've heard this before, but in some ways you're doing harm by stopping. That's a little bit scary, right? And so it's certainly one of the things I do, and while I agree with Doug, I'd like to have a company waiting in the wings to pass all this stuff out. It's hard to do, right? And so I think that maybe we need to engage the companies more, frankly, in this process. We do our science, we have these great ideas, and we hope somebody's going to pick it up. But maybe there's a different process by which we can rethink that a little bit and figure out how to get that closer along.
I'll be short here. I think most of the things that we do that are breakthroughs in life or are sticky policy related issues oftentimes are paradoxical. They have tensions to them. Think about all of us now with our phones. We love our phones and we hate our phones simultaneously, right? So the technology can open things up, but oftentimes it can foreclose on other types of opportunities. So I like to think of it all at times that the technology, we shape it simultaneously to it shaping us, and that is just not contained, particularly in an academic environment, within the immediate interface of the individual. That oftentimes this means that it's expands to a much larger population, and there's tension in that as well. To what degree do you have somebody that is potentially harmed as an individual, but the technology or the research that's been done on that has a greater good? These have been ethical challenges we've had for a long time.
I will just add that a related topic that in a way will amplify some of the points that my colleague David was making in his remarks is that in a country where we don't have a single payer healthcare system, it's a difficult argument to make that everyone should sign up for research because they're all going to benefit from the results of the information that is developed, because we know that in an unequal society, not everyone will benefit equally, which is not to say we should stop trying to have heterogeneous subject populations in our trials. Of course we should, for justice reasons, and because it will give us data that will allow us to apply the results broadly across society. But it's an easier argument to make that Brandon or anyone should participate in a trial because they're likely to benefit when the product hits the market.
And I'll just, one other thing I want to say about this, and I think this is another question, is Brandon, it's, and I'll say the terms maybe the right ones, it's easier to justify an implant, right? We have this idea that his situation with missing a hand is large enough to overcome the barriers of an implant. The interesting part, though, is most technology, if you kind of think about it, doesn't really start in medicine in a lot of ways, right? So Brandon could benefit if this had a broader application. But without a broader application, it's going to be really challenging to get this out there. And so I think that the other thing we have to think about is what are the other places, and this is part of the reasons we're trying to think broader about what it is, but what are the other places this technology has value? And then I think that, speaking of ethics and legal and the other components, is how does it go through the FDA? What do we do, or what is the right agency? I mean, basically, if it's not a medical device, where does the FDA sit on this? What are the regulatory pathways that sort of protect the consumer, protect the individual, right? So there's a whole bunch of other pieces that come into this. But Unless we can sort of change our mindset a little bit that, you know, it's only medical technology and only somebody that's got a horrific thing can benefit from this. I mean, how do we sort of change that and turn that on its ear a little bit? Because at the end of the day, somebody that's had the injury would benefit from someplace else going forward. Like cell phones made it because of communications and mass market. Chips get built in aircraft and auto, and then we use them in medicine, right? We don't build them in medicine. So I think we can think about what are the other approaches to getting out there, not just, I don't want a grant because I can't support it. I mean, think of the flip side of your question. If I didn't write the grant to make an impact because I worry about that subject at the end, is that more or less ethical for that same question? So it's sort of both sides are not the ideal pretty side of it. Yeah.
I had a question about accessibility. So how do we ensure that people who are low income, uninsured, maybe don't even know this tech is out there, how do we make sure that they get it too? And it seems like right now it's up to policymakers, but how involved should scientists be in that process?
It's a great question.
You might imagine my answer is going to be that I think that scientists should be involved in policy making. I actually think that academics have an obligation to share the results of their research outside of the academy in ways that are accessible to mere mortals, and to engage in policy-making conversations so that the decisions that get made about how to distribute resources in society can be informed by evidence. And I think that many of our universities don't have systems for encouraging or rewarding policy-making engagement by faculty. Many of them have rules against being involved in lobbying per se, but even if you're not lobbying, even if you're merely just getting your results out in the kind of popular media instead of academic journals, our traditional privilege and tenure structures within the university typically don't reward that time spent on those kinds of activities. So I think it's important that people see the value, take it upon themselves to do it anyway, even if they won't get rewarded for it by tenure, because it's so important for the good of society.
I'll add one more thing. Go ahead. You would add.
So we just took place in a project in one of our underserved communities in Cleveland, and it was a technology-related project with intention. When we engaged that particular community, we thought about it from the perspective of how do we begin to think about the needs of the community from their own perspectives. So yeah, we were intentional about access and reaching out, but that it was the approach that we used, I think, that was significant to this. So it ended up becoming a community-led program within the neighborhoods, led by the people that were actually living in the community and working within that community. And I think this gets back to what David was talking about, is I wasn't going to have the same cachet coming in, flashing around my degrees and white face in a predominantly black underserved community, right? And in fact, I can't pretend to know that community. But if I could begin to work with that community in such a way that they begin, in a way where I can build trustworthiness in that community, then trust begins to emerge. And when that trust begins to emerge, you start to see that access coming from the bottom up. It's really interesting perspective. They begin to push or develop the confidence to push from the bottom up through the right channels.
There's a community, a Seminole community in South Florida, and there's Hard Rock Cafe in South Florida that makes a lot of money. And the money is there, but there are a whole lot of people in that community who are dying from diabetes. So the doctors at Cleveland Clinic decided to go in and give free talks, and the Hard Rock Cafe gave the space. So money wasn't the issue at all, but they weren't showing up. So when we speak about access and accessibility, there has to be an education component. Look at informed consent, for example. if an informed consent is written in such a way that, number one, the participant, or supposed to be participant, has no idea what it's saying, the language is confusing and complex, then that doesn't help. Secondly, if informed consent is given, or it's requested and given at the time when a person is about to die, that seems to be blatantly unfair. Because at that point, you sign anything. Whatever you say, sign, yeah, that's all, I'm gonna die anyway, so I'm gonna sign it. That doesn't help with the trustworthiness. So it goes to what, Nick, what you said is, I think is exactly correct, that while we're in the beginning stages, where we are now, the branding stage and so on, that there has to be another side, another component, another group who picks up the mantle. And W.B. Du Bois said, he had what's called a talented tenth. How do you educate these blacks who just came out of slavery? Train the talented tenth, those who are pastors and educators, the teachers, because they will have access to go back and teach and train their own. Because once the population, Nick just said, once you have the population who, they're gonna trust those who have been trustworthy with them, that's their own, because this white guy coming in, and I don't trust you, you don't look right, I don't know what you wanna do. So therefore, you're not gonna trust, but once that happens, then momentum builds, and we move from 5% or less than 5% in clinical trials to larger numbers. So accessibility is two sides, not just one. So to get it done, we have to do it in a different way.
But I want to say too that going through this effort to kind of get this group up and running, and I don't mean for this table here, but in general, and Sue hint on this, none of the incentives work, right? Nothing that we do right now is in really any way built to make this happen on a regular basis. The incentives, for example, for Nick and what he does are different than the incentives for me. I didn't really fully understand that, right? So how much time can you give is a question I ask for people to, when we start getting into this institute. Well, I got all this to do. And so usually for an academic like myself, it's like, well, if we get a grant, right, if you get, a couple $100,000, that's gonna make people happy. He goes, oh, no. Which my world ended right there when money didn't matter. But what it comes down to is sort of the cachet, what the things are in different societies is different communities within this. And I think that, and the same thing when David started telling his stories, I was blown away, honestly, right? Because I don't want to think that I have these issues, that I'm willing to take anybody in this study, of course. I have no inherent, resistance, but that's a stupid statement, right? That's an ignorance of the whole situation. I don't realize it's not whether I'm willing to, it's whether I'm willing to go out and take the effort to make sure everybody feels trustworthy in this and part of it. And so my point of all this is the dialogue was actually the most important thing here, to have this group together. But how many of you can write a grant where you have this group of people? What funding mechanisms sit out there? What do we do in our daily life that puts this on the funding round, right? That's hard. And so there's really not a ton of motivation for me and any other academic out there to go and say, yeah, I'm gonna spend my time and beg my chair to look the other way. Well, I can't cover part of it because I want to put together a panel like this, right? So not even just a panel, but a group, that meets. And the panel is fun. It was great. But that's so not useful in the end of the day if we don't carry on the dialogue, right? So we did this for neuroscience. We've had some conversation. It's tomorrow that matters. It's not today, right? And if we all have to go back and do our thing, then this fails. So I think that when we think about this, we always think about the short solution. How do I write my informed consent different, and where do I send it for? But that's trivial relative to the big problem, which is to have a dialogue, a sustained, realistic dialogue. And that's how we have to figure out. We sort of lost. We get buried in our own areas, I think.
I want to add just one more comment to that, and that is, I was talking about, am I on?
Yeah.
I was talking about virtues before, and I think trustworthiness is a virtue that's really important, and it's one that every member of this panel has really taken to heart. But there's another virtue that's important, and that's courage. It takes some courage to speak the truth when you're worried about hurting the other person's feelings. It takes courage to admit if you have a blind spot. It takes courage to be transgressive in terms of walking across organizational lines for which, well, maybe you won't get punished, but you certainly won't get rewarded for the time. You've got to take it on extra. So I think part of what we're trying to demonstrate here through this team is that we're saying that if these important complex social problems are going to get fixed with the help of technology, technology's not going to solve them, but it can be a component, then we all have to be willing to take that leap and do more differently than whatever our comfort zone, whatever's typical for us. And that's hard to do.
Vivian Shahwar from the University of Alberta. I work with implantables and wearables to improve the abilities of people with who've lost some functions. I love this panel, and I stood up and sat down, and you kind of addressed a lot of my comments. One thing that I should really say is congratulations for putting this panel together. This is, even if this is just a first step, this is a very, very critical step. And I completely appreciate what it takes to bring multidisciplinary groups to take on this big vision. And that vision is really a critical vision. I think that's how we should be thinking about technology and humans. We really should be thinking about this from a symbiotic relationship. But at the same time, I think it's very important, and of course we've brought up all the reasons why this couldn't work, but we're just gonna make it work is the bottom line. At the same time, we really need to be thinking about equity, diversity, and inclusion at multiple levels. So we talked about access, but I think the whole institute, I'm thinking there's going to be an institute, or there is an institute, should probably be having principles of equity, diversity, and inclusion in them. Our ethics protocols should have equity and diversity and inclusion in them. And they're not as easy as just changing the consent form. There has to be a clear effort to go out and do that. And I think if we ourselves start doing that, then we're going to force everyone above us and everyone below us to actually move in that path. And I'm just kind of preaching here to the converted, so I'm just going to stop because there are a lot of questions, but I really wanted to just make the point of thanking you guys, and hopefully we'll see more of this moving forward.
Thanks, Vivian. I'll just use your words as a plea, but I think this is something we're trying to grow, right? I mean, ultimately, this is us to say we think this is an important way to move these things forward, and ultimately, it's not us, it's all of us, right? And so I'd love to see as many people as possible be engaged in the institute or whatever it turns out to be, but the goal is to be outside of not just one department or one school, but to be across institutions. And when we all start having the dialogue, there's power in that, right? And so we start to think about how do we influence funding agencies? How do we influence government agencies? It's not by one of us bitching, right? It's about all of us taking a concerted effort. And so the more we can get behind and work together, I think the more impact that we can have and solve these problems.
Thank you everyone for speaking. I just wanted to go back to the accessibility question and maybe expand it to a global perspective. So when we think about globally, we know that we kind of stratify countries into developing and developed countries, and we know that non-developing countries, they're still struggling with things like basic sanitation. There's like 20% child mortality rates. And so when we start talking about technology like this, it's sort of unfeasible in locations like this, but it seems like it would stratify it even further. So how do we go about making this accessible on a global level so that it doesn't exacerbate already existing issues like this?
I think it has the potential to do the opposite. I've thought a lot about this, and when we think about this concept of democratizing experiences, you could think about experiences right now tend to be highly socioeconomic driven. Right? People who have more can experience more. People who have less sometimes will experience less. But if you look at what this technology affords and what the possibilities are, it actually decreases the barrier to having access to those types of experiences. So I can envision a time when we have kids in school who wouldn't necessarily have access to be able to go travel and see another country, having the ability to be able to do that through this type of technology that we're talking about. And this is what I meant by when I said that the phenomenology is interested in taking things that are far away and making them more near. You can do this by using this technology. Now, we have to be careful with it, right? It can be used for all different kinds of things that maybe we wouldn't like. But I think it has a real possibility, a real opportunity for us to be able to overcome one of the major barriers that we have that tend to separate us, and that is the socioeconomic barriers to experiences. It is 3 o'clock.
Yeah, so that's good. So obviously,
Oh.
yeah, one more question.
So it occurs to me that a lot of these diversity and inclusion problems could be solved if this was significantly cheaper. I mean, these are like $100,000 or $1 million, implants. I'm assuming. So if it was like 100 times or 1,000 times cheaper, I think it would be much more accessible. So what would be necessary to be able to do that?
One really good video game. And I say that somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but the reality is we need a market. I mean, we need some place where the value proposition is proper, that people are willing to push it there, right? So we're facing the one-offs. I mean, every technology, I mean, you could talk, any computer chip, if it didn't have a large market, nobody would ever have it, right? And to Vivian's point earlier is like, or I'm sorry, Ivana was talking about third world. I mean, how many people have phones in these places, right? I mean, that was an incredibly expensive technology when we started, but when it finds the size market that when we can do it in mass, it's the original. I mean, all the expenses are in the original work, right? They're not really in the production to so much. There's a surgical medical cost, but obviously there's that market size that would help. So part of the motivation for getting this started was I'm gonna feel like a complete failure if Brandon's the only one that gets this or a few others, right? So how do we move this out there? And that became, some people in the audience were pushing me on quite a bit. Right? So speaking of the funding sources going, what's next? What are you going to do with our money, right? And that's a legitimate question. But it became a challenge as to how we're going to do that. And because of the headwinds, we have to deal with that. And then there's the whole paradigm shift, right? I mean, the idea, and Doug talked about this earlier, that maybe we aren't going to have to be implanted. But if so, is there a paradigm shift that's going to happen? I mean, all of us have I remember when the Newton came out, right? The Apple Newton, so I'm old. That thing failed. That was a paradigm shift we weren't ready for, right? But now everybody has exactly what the Newton was. So again, how do we make that happen is not just a dialogue of the technology, it's a dialogue of the phenomenology, it's a dialogue of the environment, it's the use case. And so while it's a short answer to say a market, because that can bring our costs down, and we have to think more about what that means and how we actually get into that market. And as a researcher, I can easily say, it obviously works. Look, this is awesome. You should buy this. Medtronic's not going to be necessarily inbound with that. And how do we get it somewhere else? But if Nintendo is going to spend $1 billion on a handset, that's a game changer, right? Literally. And if you look at the fact that, I'm sorry.
It's good late.
It was pretty good. Yeah, that's right. And then the control labs, which Doug had up on a slide, they spent $500 million in Facebook for that. So it can happen, but we have to be conscious about doing it, right? And I think there's, and the last thing I'll say, and then turn it over, and then we'll end the session, is, there's this ivory tower problem sometimes where, it's only going to be for what I'm going for because that's the right solution, right? We can find any place to use this. It's valuable to get it out there. It doesn't have to be just for one application that we're trying to go at or what I'm doing with it. And we should, in the democratizing of things, we should all be working together, right? There's my technology is better than your technology problem sometimes that we should get around as well to find the right ones that do the work. So that's a long-winded answer, a lot of different things, but there's a lot of headwinds we've got to get through. Anybody else want to add to that? So we are at 3. I think we're all happy to stay around and take questions up here for anybody that wants to continue the dialogue or didn't want to ask at the microphone. I appreciate your time and attention for coming. I hope that through this you got a sense of maybe that neuroscience is a bit broader and what we can do is going to be done better if we can all work together across many spectrums. So thanks for your time and attention and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.